Hello, everyone. Welcome back to week 9. We are already 9 weeks into the semester, which means we are over halfway there. I hope you all have had a great week so far and are learning a lot about human rights and human rights violations so far. So, this week we're going to hone in on a group of individuals who um, have suffered what would arguably be human rights violations throughout the world. This week, we're going to focus on violations of the LGBTQIA plus population and kind of explain what they've gone through and what violations they face. So, as always, please make sure that you are watching this video in its entirety. I will timestamp it. I will not be on camera this week. I do not feel very well, and I do not look like being camera ready. So, I hope you all are taking care of yourselves. It is getting to be that season where sickness kind of goes around. So, um, without further ado, let's go ahead and start. So you may be rolling your eyes and thinking, why are we even spending time on this population and on this topic? Because um, LGBTQIA people have rights, and in the United States, they're recognized as very similar to everyone else. Well, I would ask you to stop and kind of consider that statement. The LGBTQ plus population has been fighting for their rights and the rights that they even have today for several decades. The fight for LGBTQ plus population rights in the United States dates back all the way to the mid 1920s. And has gone through a lot of iterations and a lot of difficulties that mirror the civil rights movement. And we're going to look at kind of going back to the 1950s and 1960s. Uh, LGBTQ, or as it was called then, homosexuality, was considered a mental health issue. It was a diagnosed mental health issue in the United States, and it was recognized just as that, as a disorder. And so it hasn't been until probably the last 20 years um, that that diagnosis has gone away, and it has been recognized as not a mental health diagnosis. You're going to see a movie called The Lavender Scare. And The Lavender Scare is a very interesting piece of LGBTQ history in that it was the United States. It was during the um, rise of communism fear in the United States. And the Lavender Scare was basically um, the United States' response to potential communism infiltration. And so, what the Lavender Scare was all about was in the 1950s, um, government employees who were found out to be homosexual were fired. They did not have employment protections, they were immediately fired. And what was so detrimental about this scare was that even if you were suspected to be homosexual, or if you um, were seen or associated with a homosexual, you would be terminated because the thought was that because they were homosexuals, they were more likely to be um, manipulated into bringing communism into the United States. And so the Lavender Scare is really just an era where um, LGBTQ plus um, people had to remain in hiding and had to worry about being found out And if they were found out, they would be terminated and looked down upon and couldn't work in the government. And so that was really kind of one of the first kind of big scares. But during this time, you had a lot of different laws that were in play in the United States that banned homosexual behaviors. So you had a lot of laws that had bans against sodomy, and those laws were directly put into place to ban homosexual behavior. There were also laws against dressing out of your sex norm. And so, what do we mean by dressing out of your sex norm? So, if you were a male, you could not dress in a feminine way. If you were a female, you could not dress in a masculine way. There were laws that strictly prohibited this practice, I guess you could call it. So that brings us to the Stonewall Inn. And the Stonewall Inn was a gay bar. It was a homosexual bar, a safe space where people could be themselves. And this was in New York. And the police like to raid the Stonewall Inn. They like to come in and, for small violations like liquor violations or something like that. But what they were really doing was suppressing homosexual acts. So while they would get in with liquor violations, what they would really be doing is arresting people who were dressed outside of their sexual norm. Or if they saw two men kissing, they would arrest them for lewd and lascivious acts and things like that. So that they were using the law to suppress homosexuality. Well, one night in 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. And this night, the patrons of that inn decided that they were going to fight back. And this caused a riot, and it's known as the Stonewall Riot. And this riot was a major turning point in the fight for LGBTQIA plus rights. Now, you're going to see Henry on this slide dating back to the 1920s. Henry Gerber founded the first document on gay rights organizations called the Chicago Society for Human Rights. So there had been a fight before Stonewall. However, Stonewall is universally recognized as a turning point in the gay rights era or the queer rights era. And these riots lasted for pretty much the summer of 1960s and into the 70s. And you really see that this is starting to spawn um, recognition and proclamation that LGBTQIA plus individuals deserve the same human rights as everyone else, as their heterosexual counterparts. So there are a couple of videos that will be on the next two slides. One is just the history of LGBTQIA, and then one is a video on the lavender scare itself. These are linked in folio. Please make sure that you take the time to watch them. They are great visual representations of what we have been talking about. So before we dive too deep into this, let's come to a consensus on who are we talking about when we are talking about LGBTQIA plus people. Well, LGBTQIA plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and other individuals who identify as gender minority or of minority sexual orientation. I'm going to link the exact slideshow in Folio instead of doing it as a PDF file because there are several embedded links in this PowerPoint that you can kind of click on. So you can click on here, the word here, to kind of find out more about each one of these. But LGBTQIA, the acronym itself, really stands for sexual um, minorities, like gender minorities, and sexual orientation. So you're really talking about sexual orientation and then gender minorities. According to the 2021 Gallup poll, and this is the latest information that we have, 5.6% of the US population identify as LGBTQIA plus. That's about 18.5 million people in the United States, and you can kind of see the breakdown. You notice that the majority of people in the United States identify as bisexual, which means that they are sexually attracted to individuals of both genders. And then that is followed up by gay, which is males being attracted to men, and then lesbian, and then transgender. So there's a lot of different reasons why this population has been targeted and is vulnerable to human rights abuse. One of the biggest reasons is that of political and religious extremism. The rise of the neo Christian right movement has, at its core, um, I have to be very careful how I word this. The neo right Christian movement, at its core, has promoted discriminatory practices against this population of people um, under the guise of religious persecution. The Bible says, Jesus says, Allah says. That is one of the biggest reasons that this population is vulnerable because it goes against the social norm of the religious movement. And the religious movement has been rising for several decades now. And especially in the United States, the Christian movement has risen and kind of um, created and weaponized religion as a whole to target this population of people. Because of that, the religious rise has infiltrated our politics as well. And so you see this with abortion bans, you see this um, one, with religious ideology kind of being the main focus of politics. Um, uh, y- and I'm being very careful. Just we'll get to why I'm being very careful. But this conversation can get very triggering to a lot of people. So I will give you that warning. But there's a lack of political representation for LGBTQIA people. Now, let me say this. Over the past 3 years, there is a rise in political representation. However, as a whole, there is a lack of political representation that can be directly associated to the Christian right movement. I got these statistics for this year because I wanted to have the most updated statistics. There are 1,204 LGBTQIA elected officials nationwide. The breakdown is there are 3 governors, 12 U.S. Congress members, 60 mayors, 250 or 225 state legislators and 139 judicial um, representatives. That is your breakdown of that 1,204. That LGBTQIA population represents 0.23% of the full electorate. And sometimes non LGBTQIA representatives don't really have the best interest of this population at heart. And it's easier to play to the political extremes with this population being typically persecuted due to that religious neo fascist Christian agenda. A lot of this agenda vilifies LGBTQIA populations. They are thought to be immoral. Um, they the lifestyle that they live is considered illegal in a lot of societies, and they're not worthy of legal protections. As you will see throughout the world, um, there are laws still in place worldwide that prohibit homosexual behavior. I will say we have to remember that it wasn't until the last 20 years that the United States has kind of um, addressed some of these laws in our own nation to kind of take away those restrictions and kind of give LGBTQIA plus people more freedoms. We've talked about the political, cultural, and social spheres. Um, you need to know the word heteronormativity. And heteronormativity basically means that the social norm is that of heterosexualism. So, man marrying woman. Again, there's an argument out there that I can make that this all goes back to um, rel- religious fascism permeating through our political and social cultures. However, um, whatever this norm of heteronormativity has resulted in homophobia, which has led to um, multiple violations to this population. And then there's this norm of violence toward LGBTQIA individuals. And impunity is often granted for these violations, which means that we historically we have not really um, we've not really prosecuted a lot of these. Hate crime laws, which we will talk about in a little bit, are relatively new in our society. Specialized laws that target people because of hate um, being their motive has not been a norm, and is not a norm uh, worldwide. So impunity is often granted for violence and discrimination. And we see that even today, even though you believe that we have evolved in our laws, we still really haven't. And we are regressing a lot in our laws now. You can see recent Supreme Court decisions, which are linked in the video section below. I'm thinking specifically 303, um, which grants impunity for discriminatory practices. 303 was a case out of Colorado last year, in which a website designer basically stated that Colorado telling me that I had to create um, websites for gay couples violated my First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court agreed and basically said, you can't tell someone they can't discriminate. You can't tell a private business they can't discriminate based on freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So, in an essence, we have hidden behind constitutional protections, or what should be constitutional protections, to really give impunity for discrimination. So, we have placed an emphasis on certain constitutional protections in the name of upholding our freedoms for really kind of suppressing other people's freedoms. Homophobia has been promulgated by the state, just as I was talking about with, um, sorry, I'm trying to write down time codes. Um, just kind of over the last several decades, we've criminalized same-sex behavior and gender non-conforming. There's consistent anti-LGBTQIA rhetoric and policy by political figures. We're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in Florida and throughout the United States with kind of trying to peel back those protections. There is a Supreme Court case called Obergefell, which happened during the Obama administration, that in which that Supreme Court uh, gave LGBTQIA plus people the right to marry. Yes, it is only within the last 10 years that LGBTQIA people have had the right to marry their spouses. But before we get there, I want you to think, can you think of any countries where government officials espouse hate and criminalize LGBTQIA plus people? You know of any countries other than the United States? There's plenty of political rhetoric, especially from the Republican side, which typically leans more toward the Christian ideology and philosophy. Um, or they utilize that basis utilizes Christianity as a weapon for discrimination. So, have you thought about some? Well, if you can't think of any, you're going to learn a little bit about them. There are 67 countries that criminalize same sex practices. Nine of those countries have laws explicitly criminalizing gender expression. And then seven of those countries permit the death penalty for same sex practices. Yes, this is 2023, and there are still countries that that have the death penalty for same sex practices. In many countries, the laws are vague. In others, they're very specific. There are discrepancies between men and women, married men versus unmarried men. And there are a wide range of penalties. I want you to stop this lecture and I want you to go to that website that's on there. That website is a fantastic website to where you can kind of see the criminal penalties um, for homosexual behavior and kind of look and see, do any of these countries surprise you? There is a country in the Middle East right now that has someone on death row uh, because they were found out to be homosexual. So the international community has recognized that this population of people is extremely vulnerable. And so I want you to think about, what were you doing in 2006? For me, I had just graduated high school and just started college. I can remember it vividly. I was a sophomore in college in 2006. What were you doing in 2006? Well, the reason I bring up 2006 is because that was the year that several experts in international LGBTQ plus rights came together and created what was known as the Yogyakarta Principles. The Yogyakarta Principles serve as a universal guide to human rights, which affirm binding international legal standards with which all states must comply. They specifically address LGBTQ plus rights. These principles are divided into 8 categories, which you can read here, and they range from the right to universal enjoyment of human rights, to freedom of expression, to freedom of movement and asylum, to defending the defenders of LGBTQ plus. Now, another important date that I want you to think of is the date of 2017. Do you know what you were doing in 2017? Well, the reason that this date is important is because that is when the Yogyakarta principles were expanded. And in 2017, the Yogyakarta principles were expanded by supplemental principles to protect gender expression and sex characteristics. Now, the Yogyakarta principles are great for this population. They set out our international expectations of what legal standards should be. However, the Yogyakarta principles have never been accepted by the United Nations. Therefore, much like the UDHR, the Yogyakarta principles aren't binding laws. The Yogyakarta principles are just a guiding set of principles that address LGBTQ rights internationally. So, since they've never been accepted by the United Nations, let's talk a little bit about what the United Nations has done in the realm of LGBTQ plus um, human rights. The United Nations has pushed for change in this area, even though they have not formally recognized the Yogyakarta principles. They have added LGBTQIA rights as human rights, and that was done by the Third Committee, and this was done in 2016. So think about that. 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. 7 years ago. 7 years ago is when the United Nations finally recognized human rights for LGBTQIA plus people within your lifetime. So when we think of this population and this topic as not really being appropriate to discuss in terms of human rights, you're wrong. This population has suffered atrocities throughout the years, and it wasn't until 7 years ago that the United Nations has formally stepped in and recognized LGBTQ rights as human rights. Now, there are over 850 NGOs, which are non governmental organizations, that have called for the United Nations to continue to strengthen the protections and largely for the right to engage in same sex behavior or gender non-conforming behavior. So, transgender behavior still really probably isn't as protected as it should be. We still have a lot to be done, as evidenced by what's going on in the United States. Florida has banned the word gay, essentially. They haven't really. But essentially, they have banned teachers from talking about this in classrooms or even acknowledging homosexuality. So if a child comes in that has two fathers and that child says, "Hey, I have two dads," that teacher can't acknowledge that. There have been several books that have been banned um, in several states in the United States here recently under the guise of it them being inappropriate. Well, what really has been happening is books that affirm any type of LGBTQIA plus um, practice. So, um, any book that has a gay character or any book that references homosexuality being okay is typically banned. So we're seeing these discriminatory practices still being utilized here in America. Biggest issues here in the United States has been against protecting LGBTQIA plus youth in school and the rights of transgendered youth and college athletes. So, again, we talked a little bit about Florida. If you're not familiar, the Human Rights Watch has a lot of information on legislation and things like that that has happened. There's well over 500 pieces of legislation nationwide that directly impact LGBTQIA plus rights negatively. So some of this legislation is if a teacher uh, finds out that a child is homosexual or is questioning their gender fluidity, they are required to tell the parents, which in turn can make that child really unsafe. Recent legislation to ban the instruction of sexual orientation and gender identity in Florida. And then you're seeing a lot of conversation around transgendered women in sports and testing levels of testosterone in women athletes um, or anything like that. So, um, these are ongoing issues that we are still seeing today and that we are facing in our nation today. Tennessee has just banned what are known as drag shows, which are um, men dressing up as women and like having full on shows. Uh, they have banned any type of non-gender conforming behavior in public. And so essentially they have banned drag shows. And so we're getting back to that era of the 50s and 60s with our legislation where um where the rights of the LGBTQI plus population um is coming under fire. So we see discriminatory laws with adoption, with education, marriage. It wasn't until recently that Obergefell opened up the door to allow same sex marriage. Employment. There are still states to where sexual orientation is not a protected class under their discriminatory laws. So in those states, people can be still be fired if they are found out to be homosexual. There are also issues in seeking asylum. Um, about 40% of asylum seekers who identify as LGBTQ are determined to be not at risk of persecution. So, again, the people making the determination of why they're seeking asylum doesn't recognize the dangers that they are facing in their countries because they're LGBTQ plus. They don't recognize those as true issues to warrant asylum. Um, Issues about making decisions for partners in healthcare systems. So let's pretend that you are a same sex couple and your partner is in the hospital. You have been together for 50 years, and your partner is in the hospital and is on death door. There are states that will not allow you to be in the hospital with your partner, um, because only friends or only family could be there. And in those states, they do not recognize same sex partnership as family. There are also um, certain states that and certain countries that will not allow same-sex partners to make decisions such as like healthcare decisions, funeral decisions, things like that. So imagine that you and your partner have been together for 50 years. Your partner's family disowned them because they were gay. And now your partner has died. And the state does not recognize your relationship. So the family that disowned your partner is now the people who are making the decisions about burial and funeral and things like that and leaving you out of that. Those are the real issues that are facing LGBTQ plus populations. And often LGBTQ plus populations are are excluded from access to shelters for violence, like domestic violence. Um, the United States, I don't really see this that much. However, internationally, you do see this because internationally there are still laws that ban homosexual behavior. So why would you go to a um, shelter that's supposed to protect you if you're in that um, partnership that's violent, if the whole relationship is against the law in the first place? LGBTQIA plus population are extremely vulnerable for violence and abuses in our culture. If you've never heard of the term hate crimes, then you need to look that up. Hate crimes are crimes that are perpetrated with the intent um, to harm someone because of their minority status. And some people are attacked just for being lesbian, gay, transgender, or gender nonconforming. In fact, the latest statistics are about from about 3 years ago, and there are about a little over 1,400 hate crimes that targeted just because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. And they represent about 19% of all hate crimes. So, um, this is still a very real issue. And I will tell you that I am teaching a class specifically on hate crimes next semester, if you're a criminal justice major, where we will talk about all forms of hate crimes. Because hate crimes don't just encompass LGBTQIA plus people. Hate crimes can be because of race, sex, sexual orientation, things like that. But LGBTQIA plus population is extremely vulnerable for violence because of the political extremism, or their view of being lesser than, because they don't conform to the social norms. Another form of violence that we see internationally is that of torture. Torture is one of the major human rights violations against LGBTQ plus populations globally. It's especially prominent in the Middle East, Africa, and Russia. So here you're going to see four countries, just that we're going to highlight. So in Iran, authorities are permitted to torture people who are or who are suspected of being um, in this spectrum of LGBTQIA plus. In Cameroon, torture is used as coercive measures to get confessions, which are then used to convict and imprison gay men. Because in Cameroon, uh, being homosexual is against the law. Then in Chechnya, police have complete immunity to torture against LGBTQIA plus people. And this country also encourages honor killings. So, honor killings are killings um, of people who are said to have brought dishonor to their family. And so, with the stigma of homosexuality and it being illegal, that is thought to have brought some dishonor to your family. So in Chechnya, they are encouraged to kill um, those people who they feel have dishonored their family. And then in Nigeria, it's pretty much the same. Torture is used in coercive measures to get confessions, um, and they're immune to any kind of legal aspects of retribution. The United States is not immune from using torture techniques for this population. Conversion therapy is what we hide the torture under. And conversion therapy is basically therapy to convert a homosexual to a heterosexual. And this happens in private facilities. Little is known about the scope of conversion therapy, but we know that it's a multifaceted process. So on your screen, you're going to see several types of practices used in conversion therapy. So you have like talk therapy, you have electroshock therapy. Some of them use think that they need an exorcism to convert them to being a heterosexual. You have behavioral conditioning, and the fact that what will happen is they will hook you up to like an electroshock. That's typically behavioral conditioning and electroshock therapy are typically used together. And so they will show you images of like men, and if you get aroused, they will shock you. Or if you're a female and they show you pictures of females and you get aroused, they will shock you until it kind of conditions you to not become aroused when you see them. There are some hypnosis, hospital confinements, and then there are beatings and corrective violence, such as raping, or forced sex with opposite sexes. So, conversion therapy is not just something in the United States. You see the countries on your screen right now that use this aversion treatment, is basically what conversion therapy is. Aversive treatment, it involves electroshocks on hands, head, stomach, and genitals when with the presentation of homoerotic stimuli, which I was just talking about, but it also involves nausea-inducing medication or requires an individual to snap a rubber band on their wrist whenever they um, have homoerotic thoughts. Part of conversion therapy that we see worldwide as well as the use of corrective violence. So this is violence used to punish queer people or to enforce gender stereotypes. These are typically take on the form of sexual assault or rape, which is sometimes called curative sex. So that is something you will want to remember. And it's often perpetrated by family members. Uh, Again, remember those honor killings. So you're going to try curative sex. And then if that doesn't work, the corrective violence doesn't work, then you kind of go to honor killings. Perpetrators in these conversion therapies practices? Well, health professionals, police, religious practitioners, and community members make up a large portion of the perpetrators. Um, Not all are qualified or even properly trained to do conversion therapy. Um, and the terminology is misleading. Um, this harkens back to thinking that homosexuality is a mental illness, which was back in the 50s, 60s era. We recognize now, and the discipline of psychology recognizes now that homosexuality is not a mental illness. Therefore, conversion therapy really doesn't work because you're not correcting a mental illness. Um, Therapy does have state involvement with it. It's perpetrated by state support or lack of prevention of conversion therapy. Sometimes judges or police will order conversion therapy. Governments provide assistance or reimbursement to those who perform conversion therapy. Um, they don't regulate it. They promote the legitimacy or they legitimize conversion therapy. And then they don't put any laws in place to kind of thwart conversion therapy. So that's all ways that we see state support and state involvement in the conversion therapy process. We've talked a lot about the violations that LGBTQIA plus people undergo worldwide. Hopefully, you have a better understanding of why this topic is important. There are several videos that I want you to watch that I have linked into Folio. So you're going to see how politics plays a role in this with the political extremism. There are several, even in our most recent Republican debates, there have been candidates that have called for destruction of LGBTQIA people and advocated for conversion therapy. Um, but what do we need to do about it? Like, how do we stop these atrocities from happening? Well, the United Nations is pushing for leadership in non Western nations to kind of step up and address these issues. Um, there's more funding for research going in. We need to start looking at um, the laws that are criminalizing non heteronormative behaviors. There's an increase in laws criminalizing non heteronormative behaviors right now. And so until we kind of get that under control, we're still going to see discriminatory practices happening. And then we need to eradicate the impunity for violence against LGBTQIA plus people. As you've seen in this presentation, several state sanctioned um, violence violent methods have been utilized against LGBTQIA plus people through laws and impunity laws. Um, we need to get rid of those. And slowly but surely, we are taking steps forward, but we're in an era right now where we're also taking steps back and kind of going back to criminalizing this population of people worldwide. All right, so that is the presentation this week. Please make sure you watch the videos. I did not do a discussion board this week, so make sure you take the quiz and work on your papers. I hope everyone has a great week. Bye.